I've closed deals that would make most people's heads spin. I've sat across from men who own half the skyline in Chicago and New York. Men who look at you like you're nothing more than a glitch in their expensive matrix. I've spent 25 years perfecting the art of the corporate mask. That calm, unshakable expression that tells the world I belong in the room, even when the air in that room feels like it's trying to squeeze the life out of me. But let me tell you something. Sitting in seat 2A on that Tuesday morning, 30,000 feet above the clouds, I realized that all the money in my bank account and all the titles on my business card couldn't buy me a single extra breath of oxygen. You know that feeling when the floor just falls away. Not in a metaphorical way, but in a way that makes your stomach try to exit through your throat. It was a dead drop. Just a second, maybe two, where the plane lost its grip on the air, and we were just a heavy tube of metal falling through the sky. I've been on 1,000 flights, but this was different. This wasn't turbulence. This was the earth calling us back down. And she sounded angry. Before I get into the heart of this, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever had a moment where time just stops? Where you realize that everything you thought mattered, your job, your bills, your pride is suddenly worth absolutely nothing? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching this from. Or just leave a yes if you've ever felt that soul-shaking realization. I need to know I'm not the only one who's had to face that kind of cold, hard truth. And if you're new here, or if you feel like these stories speak to your own journey, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We're all just trying to navigate this life together. And sometimes, the only way through is to share the weight. That morning started out like any other. I was headed to LA for a merger. I had my Italian suit on, my armor. I've learned over the years that as a black man in my position, you don't just show up. You present. You make sure there's not a single thread out of place. Because people are always looking for a reason to count you out. I was leaning back in that oversized leather seat. The kind that costs more than some people make in a month. Sipping on a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt expectations. Across the aisle in 2B, there was a man. Let's call him Mr. Sterling. He was the old money type, silver hair, a watch that probably cost as much as my first house, and eyes that didn't quite know what to do with me. He'd been giving me the look since we boarded. You know, the one. It's not a dirty look. Exactly. It's a look of mild confusion, like he was trying to figure out if I was a famous athlete or just someone who'd somehow wandered into the wrong cabin. I'm used to it. I've lived my whole life in that gaze. I just nodded at him, kept my mask on, and turned back to my laptop. But then, there was Maya. She was sitting a few rows back, right at the edge of the first-class divider. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old. She was a beautiful little girl, with these deep, soulful eyes and hair braided into neat, intricate patterns that reminded me so much of my own nieces. She had these oversized noise-canceling headphones on and was tapping away at a tablet, completely oblivious to the tension in the cabin or the heavy silence of the adults around her. There was something about her, a stillness. Most kids are fidgeting, asking for snacks, or kicking the seat in front of them. Not her. She looked like she was in her own world, a world where she was completely in control. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the drop. It was the silence. Have you ever noticed how a plane has a specific heartbeat? That low, constant hum of the engines that eventually just becomes part of your own breathing. Well, that heartbeat skipped. It didn't stop, but it changed its rhythm. It went from a confident roar to a strained, mechanical whine. I looked up from my spreadsheets. I saw a flight attendant, A young woman named Sarah, who'd been smiling and serving drinks just 10 minutes ago, rushed past my seat. Her face wasn't just pale, it was gray. She didn't look at any of us. She was heading straight for the cockpit. She knocked. Once, twice, then used her key. The door swung open, and for a split second, I saw it. The lead pilot was slumped over, not just leaning, but completely collapsed over the controls. His headset had fallen off and was dangling near his feet. The co-pilot. He wasn't moving either. He was sitting upright, but his head was lolled back, his mouth open, looking like he'd just fallen into a deep, unnatural sleep. The air in the cabin shifted instantly. It went from the smell of expensive coffee to the sharp, metallic scent of pure adrenaline and fear. Sarah let out a small, choked gasp that she tried to hide behind her hand, but it was too late. We all heard it. We all felt the shift. Then came the second drop. This one was worse. It felt like a giant hand had reached out and slapped the plane down. Bags shifted in the overhead bins. A tray of glass flutes in the galley shattered, the sound echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. People started to murmur. That low, frantic buzzing sound that happens right before the screaming starts. Mr. Sterling across the aisle gripped his armrest so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked at me, and for the first time, the judgment was gone. There was only raw, naked terror. He wanted me to tell him it was okay. He wanted the successful man in the suit to give him a reason to believe we weren't about to become a headline. But I couldn't give him that. My own heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked back at Maya, while the rest of us were clutching our seats and praying to whatever God we'd ignored for the last 10 years. Maya was calm. She had taken off her headphones. She wasn't looking at the broken glass or the crying woman 3 rows back. She was staring at the open cockpit door. Her expression wasn't one of fear. It was recognition. It was the look a mechanic gives a broken engine, or a surgeon gives a wound. It was focused. It was heavy. The plane tilted sharply to the left. The horizon out the window began to slant at a sickening angle. I felt the pressure in my ears spike. A sharp, stabbing pain that made my head throb. The fasten seatbelt sign started flickering, accompanied by a frantic, repetitive dinging that sounded like a funeral bell. Sarah, the flight attendant, came back out of the cockpit, stumbling against the wall. "Is there a doctor?" she shouted, her voice cracking. "Please, we need a doctor." 2 men stood up, but before they could even move, the plane bucked again. They were thrown back into their seats. The oxygen masks didn't drop yet, but you could feel the air getting thin, getting cold. It felt like the very life was being sucked out of the room. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. I thought about my office, my car, my unfinished business. It all felt so small, so utterly insignificant. I looked at my hands. They were shaking. Me, the man who'd navigated corporate takeovers and survived the toughest streets of Detroit. I was trembling like a leaf. I felt that heart-wrenching pain of regret. Regret for all the times I'd chosen work over family. All the times I'd let my pride dictate my path. I thought, this is it. This is how the story ends. But then, I saw something that shook me harder than the turbulence. Maya stood up. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look at her mother, who was several rows back in coach, or at the chaos erupting around her. She unbuckled her seatbelt with a deliberate, clicking sound that seemed to cut through the noise of the screaming engines. She stepped out into the aisle, her small frame swaying with the tilt of the plane. She didn't look like a little girl anymore. She looked like a soldier. She started walking toward the front. She wasn't running. She was moving with a purpose that felt ancient, something deep in her bones. As she passed my seat, our eyes met for just a fraction of a second. There was no fear in those eyes. There was a fire there, a quiet, burning intensity that I didn't understand. Mr. Sterling saw her too. "Hey, kid, sit down," he barked, his voice laced with that reflexive authority that men like him use when they feel out of control. "You're going to get hurt. Where is her mother?" Maya didn't even blink. She didn't acknowledge him at all. She kept her eyes fixed on that open cockpit door, on the blinking red lights and the slumped silhouettes of the men who were supposed to be keeping us in the air. The plane took another sudden, violent dip, and the cabin lights flickered and died. Maya reached the threshold of the cockpit. She paused for a single heartbeat, her hand gripping the cold metal of the doorframe as the plane groaned under the stress of the descent. She looked back at the cabin one last time, not with a goodbye, but with a look of absolute, unwavering determination. Then, she stepped over the fallen headset and into the seat of power. The heavy, pressurized air of the cabin seemed to curdle as that little girl crossed the threshold into the cockpit. It was a line no passenger is ever supposed to cross, a boundary that separates the served from the servers, the living from the pilots who keep them that way. For a second, the entire plane held its breath, a collective gasp muffled by the scream of the wind outside. But that silence didn't last. Fear has a way of turning people into the worst versions of themselves, stripping away the polish of civilization until there's nothing left but raw, jagged instinct. "What are you doing? Get her out of there." Mr. Sterling's voice cracked through the tension, sharp and ugly. He unbuckled his seatbelt with a frantic jerk, his expensive watch catching the dim emergency light as he lunged forward. He wasn't trying to help. He was trying to exert control over a situation that had spiraled far beyond his tax bracket. He reached out an arm, his fingers clawing for the fabric of Maya's shirt, his face twisted into a mask of righteous panic. "She's going to kill us all. Sarah, do something. Someone grab that child." I didn't think. I didn't weigh the consequences or consider how this would look on the evening news. I just moved. I've spent my life navigating rooms where men like Sterling hold all the cards, and I've learned that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to be the wall they can't climb over. I stepped into the aisle, my larger frame blocking his path, my hand coming up to catch his wrist, mid-air. It wasn't a violent gesture, but it was absolute. "Stay in your seat, sir," I said. My voice sounded deeper than usual, vibrating in my chest like a low-frequency hum. It was the voice I used when a board meeting was falling apart, the one that commanded attention without needing to shout. "She's a child," Sterling hissed, his face inches from mine. I could see the broken capillaries in his cheeks and the sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes. But beneath that terror was something else. That old, familiar skepticism. He didn't just see a child. He saw a disruption. He saw someone who didn't belong in the seat of power. "She has no business in there. We need a professional. We need to survive." I cut him off, my grip tightening just enough to let him know I wasn't moving. And right now, she's the only one moving toward the problem while you're just making it louder. "Sit down." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the gears turning. He wanted to argue. He wanted to pull rank. But the plane gave another violent shudder, and the fight drained out of him. He sank back into his leather seat, his hands trembling as he gripped the armrests. I didn't wait for a thank you. I turned and followed the girl, Stepping into the cockpit was like walking into a nightmare made of glass and electricity. The heat in there was stifling, a thick, cloying warmth that smelled of ozone and sweat. The master caution light was strobing a rhythmic, angry red, casting long, pulsing shadows across the walls. It felt small, impossibly small for something responsible for so many lives. The scene was grimmer than it had looked from the aisle. The lead pilot was dead weight. The co-pilot was gasping, a thin trail of foam at the corner of his mouth. His eyes rolled back so far you could only see the whites. Sarah, the flight attendant, was on her knees between the seats, her hands shaking as she tried to find a pulse, her eyes wide and wet with tears. "I can't get them to wake up," she whispered, looking up at me. "I've tried everything. The air, there wasn't enough air for a minute. I think they're gone, or close to it." I looked at the controls. I'm a CEO, not an engineer. I know how to read a balance sheet, not an altimeter. To me, it was a dizzying maze of switches, levers, and glowing screens displaying numbers that were dropping far too fast. We were descending at a rate that made my stomach feel like it was floating in acid. And then there was Maya. She was standing right behind the pilot's seat, her small hands resting on the back of the headrest. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She was watching the primary flight display, that big screen in the middle that shows the horizon. She was watching the way the artificial line was tilting, the way the numbers on the right were spinning downward. "Maya," I said softly, reaching out but not touching her. "Honey, we need to get you back to your seat. We're going to try to help them." She didn't look at me. She didn't even acknowledge that I was there. "The autopilot is disconnected," she said. Her voice was tiny, but it had a clarity that chilled me to the bone. "The vertical speed is too high. If we don't level off, the wings will overstress. We're going to overspeed." I froze. That wasn't the voice of a 9-year-old girl. That was the voice of someone who understood the physics of the catastrophe we were in. Sarah looked at me, her mouth hanging open. How do you know that?" Maya finally looked at us. Her eyes were massive, reflecting the red pulse of the warning lights. "My dad," she whispered. "He told me. He always said, 'Maya, if the nose goes down and the numbers go up, you're running out of room. You have to find the blue.'" "Can you do it?" I asked. It was a crazy question. But looking at her, I didn't see a child. I saw a soul that had been prepared for a moment the rest of us were too blind to see coming. She didn't answer with words. She stepped forward, navigating around the slumped body of the pilot. She reached out and touched the yoke, the steering wheel of the plane. Her fingers were small, barely wrapping around the grip, but she held it with a reverence that was almost religious. "Help me move him," she said, nodding toward the pilot. Sarah and I looked at each other. To move a pilot is to admit that the flight is no longer in professional hands, but the plane gave another gut-wrenching heave, and the overspeed warning, a loud, rhythmic chirping, filled the cockpit. "Do it," I barked at Sarah. We grabbed the pilot. He was heavy, the dead weight of a man who had already surrendered. We dragged him out of the seat and onto the floor of the galley. My suit, my beautiful, expensive armor, was stained with his sweat and the grime of the cockpit floor, but I didn't care. The mask was gone. Maya climbed into the seat. She looked tiny in that massive chair. She reached down and found the adjustment lever, sliding the seat as far forward as it would go. Her feet still barely grazed the floor, but she didn't seem bothered by it. I stood behind her, my hands gripping the back of the observer's seat so hard I thought the metal might snap. I looked out the windshield. We were entering a thick, gray wall of clouds. The world was disappearing. All that was left was this small room, the smell of ozone, and the back of a 9-year-old girl's head. "I need the headset," she said, her voice steadying. I reached over and picked up the pilot's headset from where it had fallen. She put it on. The oversized cups swallowed her ears. She adjusted the tiny microphone. Her movements practiced, her focus absolute. I watched her hand move toward the center console. She didn't hunt for buttons. She flipped a toggle, pressed a button on the yoke, and for a second, the screaming alarms changed pitch. "This is Flight 1214, she said into the mic. Her voice was clear, ringing out through the cockpit speakers. "We have a medical emergency. Both pilots are unresponsive. I am in the left seat. Does anyone copy?" There was nothing but static for 3 long, agonizing seconds. The wind outside roared. Sarah was sobbing quietly in the corner. I closed my eyes and prayed. Then, a crackle. "Flight 1214. This is center. We hear you, but your signal is breaking up. Say again. Who is speaking?" Maya didn't flinch. "The flight attendant is here, but she's not a pilot," Maya said. "My name is Maya. I'm 9 years old. My dad taught me on the simulator every night for 3 years. I know how to fly the 737. But I need you to talk to me. I need the approach plates for LAX." I leaned down, pressing my face close to the microphone. "This is Julian Vance, CEO of Vance Global. This girl is the only one with her hands on the controls. You will talk to her, and you will do it now." A pause. "Copy that. 1214. Maya, stay calm." "Honey!" "We're getting the flight instructor on the line." Maya began to pull the heavy yoke toward her chest. The plane didn't respond at first. "It's too heavy," she whispered. I stepped forward and placed my large hands over hers. Together, we pulled, slowly, agonizingly. The nose of the plane began to rise. "We're level," Maya panted. But as we broke through that first layer of clouds, I saw jagged streaks of lightning dancing across the sky. The fuel pump light flickered red. I felt a cold, sharp dread settle in my gut as her eyes met mine in a silent, desperate plea for a miracle. That tiny, flickering red light on the pedestal felt like a hole being punched through my chest. It wasn't just a mechanical failure, it was a verdict. In the corporate world, when a project goes into the red, you pivot, you reallocate. But at 17,000 feet, red means the Reaper is knocking on the glass. I watched a 9-year-old girl hold our lives in her small, sweating palms. The silence from the radio was the loudest thing in that cockpit. It was the sound of disbelief. The radio crackled again, and the voice was different now. Steely. "Out. Flight 1214. This is the supervisor. We need to speak with an adult. We cannot authorize a minor to operate a commercial aircraft. Put the flight attendant on the radio immediately." I felt a surge of soul-crushing heat rise up the back of my neck. It wasn't just anger, it was a recognition. I knew that tone. They were staring at a crisis and choosing to see a liability instead of a savior. Maya's hand trembled on the throttle, but her eyes never left the horizon line. I snatched the headset from the hook. "Listen to me very carefully." I snarled into the mic. "This is Julian Vance. If you waste one more second questioning who is in this seat, you are signing the death warrants of 200 people. This girl is the only reason we aren't a fireball in the desert right now. Now, give us a heading and tell us how to fix this fuel pressure, or I will spend every dime I have making sure you never work in this industry again." There was a pause. Copy. 1214. Maya. Listen to my voice. This is Captain Miller. I'm a flight instructor. We're going to get you through this. To deal with the fuel pressure, look at the overhead panel. Find the fuel pump switches. Maya looked up at the ceiling of the cockpit. A dizzying array of hundreds of toggles. For a second, she looked lost. I can't see it, she whispered, her voice breaking. It's too many lights. Julian, everything is blinking. Take a breath. Maya, I said, leaning in close. Just like the simulator. Close your eyes for 1 second and remember your dad's voice. Where did he tell you to look? She closed her eyes. The plane bucked as a massive gust of wind slammed into our side. But Maya stayed still. When she opened her eyes, the fog was gone. Top left, she murmured. Third row, blue switch. She reached up and flipped it with a decisive click. The red warning light on the pedestal flickered and died. The engines found their rhythm again. It was a small victory, but it felt like a resurrection. Good job, Maya. Miller's voice came through. Now, we have a problem. The storm is closing the gates. You can't go around it. You're going to have to go through the gap. Keep your wings level. As we plunged into the heart of the storm, the world outside the glass turned into a chaotic swirl of gray and white. Hail began to pound against the fuselage. Maya was fighting the yoke, her small muscles bulging. Why do you know this, Maya? I asked. She didn't look away, but a small, sad smile touched her face. My dad, David, he was the best pilot in the world. But when he came home, they wouldn't let him fly the big routes. They said he had attitude problems. But he told me it was because they didn't like the color of his hands on the controls of a 70-ton jet. The words hit me like a physical blow. The brilliance sidelined, the excellence ignored. He bought a simulator, she continued. Every night, after I did my homework, we'd fly. He'd say, Maya, they're going to tell you the sky is too big for you, so you learn every switch. You'd be so good they can't afford to say no. He died last year. But he told me one day I'd have to find the blue. I looked at this 9-year-old girl and saw a legacy of defiance. She was the transformation of his pain into power. 1214. The winds at LAX are gusting to 50 knots. Miller's voice interrupted. The ILS, the landing system, is down. Maya, you're going to have to land this plane manually. The cabin behind us erupted in a fresh wave of screams as the plane dropped another 50 feet. I've never done a manual landing in a storm, Maya whispered. Not even on the simulator. Then today. You're a master, I said, grabbing her shoulder. Your dad is in your hands, Maya. He's the one holding that yoke with you. You can feel it. She nodded and wiped her eyes. Miller, she said into the mic, her voice dropping an octave. Sounding older, steadier. Tell the ground crews to get ready. I'm coming in. The next 20 minutes were a blur of adrenaline. Every time a bolt of lightning struck nearby, the cockpit would light up like the sun. But Maya didn't flinch. She called out the numbers, 160 knots. Flaps 15, gear down, with a cadence that was almost musical. I looked back at Sarah. She was strapped into the jump seat, her lips moving in silent prayer. Beyond the door, I knew there were 200 people oblivious to the fact that their survival rested on the shoulders of a child. We're breaking out, Maya shouted. The gray soup began to thin. Shards of city lights began to peek through the mist. But the runway was a tiny, Narrow strip of black surrounded by a sea of darkness. And we were coming in fast. Too fast. Speed is high. Maya, Miller shouted. Pull back the throttles. Maya pulled the levers back, but the wind caught the tail. The plane felt light, unstable. I can't get the nose down. Maya cried out. I lunged forward, grabbing the yoke. Together, I yelled. On 3. 1, 2, 3. We pushed. We pushed with everything we had. The nose of the Boeing 737 dipped. The runway rushed up to meet us. The wind was trying to kick our tail to the side, but we held it. We held that line like it was the only truth left in the world. The ground was feet away. I could see the fire trucks with their spinning red lights. Flare. Maya screamed. We pulled back together. The engines roared in protest. I held my breath as the giant wheels reached out for the earth. The first contact was a bone-jarring thud that rattled my very soul. The plane skipped once. A terrifying hop. But then, the weight of the machine settled. The tires screamed as they gripped the wet concrete. Maya stood on the brakes with all her weight. I felt the deceleration pull us forward into our belts. A heavy, welcoming force. We were no longer part of the sky. We were back on the ground. We were home. The plane slowed. The roar of the thrust reversers dying down. We rolled down the runway. The emergency lights of the chase vehicles reflecting off the rain-streaked windows. Maya let go of the yoke. She didn't move. She didn't cheer. She just sat there, staring out at the rain. The radio crackled. It was Miller. 1,214. You're down. My God, you did it. You actually did it. I leaned back. My suit ruined. My body aching. I reached out and gently unclipped her headset. She turned her head to look at me, and I saw the tears finally starting to spill over. Did he see it? Mr. Julian, she whispered. Do you think my dad saw it? I looked out at the rainy tarmac and back at her. Maya, I said, my voice thick with conviction. The whole world saw it, and they're never going to be able to unsee it again. I stood up and turned toward the cockpit door. 200 people were waiting to find out who had saved them. I reached for the handle, my hand hovering over the cold metal, knowing that the moment I opened this door, the world as I knew it would be changed forever. The metal latch of that cockpit door felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I pulled, and the seal broke with a soft hiss. The cabin was a ghost ship of silence. 200 people were frozen in their seats. The first sound broke the quiet, a single, ragged sob from a woman in the third row. I stepped out first. My ruined suit jacket draped over my arm. I looked back and reached out my hand. Maya took it. As we walked down that narrow aisle, the silence didn't just break, it shattered. People were reaching out, trying to touch her. I saw Mr. Sterling. He was still in 2B, his head bowed. As we passed, he looked up. His face was a map of shame. The old money authority he'd worn like a cloak was gone. The main cabin door groaned open, and the wet air of Los Angeles rushed in. It was cold, and it was beautiful. I watched the emergency crews climb the stairs. They were looking for the pilots, for the trauma, but all they found was us. Where's the pilot? One of the paramedics shouted. I pointed back toward the cockpit, but I didn't stop walking. I had Maya's hand in mine. We stepped onto the jet bridge, the ground beneath our feet feeling impossibly solid. And then I saw her. Standing at the gate was a woman who looked like she'd been carved out of the same fire as Maya. Her face was wet with tears. Maya let go of my hand. She threw herself into her mother's arms with a force that nearly knocked them both over. I stood back, leaning against the cold plastic wall, and watched them. It was a reunion that shouldn't have been a miracle, but was. The mother looked up over Maya's shoulder. Her eyes found mine. I just nodded. A slow, heavy gesture of respect. Eventually, a man in a dark suit approached me. He was talking about statements, about the FAA, about unauthorized cockpit entry. I looked at him and I felt a laugh bubbling up in my throat. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a man who realized the people at the top were still worried about the paperwork. "Sir, we need you to come with us," he said. "In a minute," I said. "I need to talk to the pilot's mother first." He blinked, confused. "The pilot is being medevaced." "Sir, his family isn't here yet. I'm not talking about the man in the uniform," I said. Stepping past him, I walked over to where Maya and her mother were sitting. Maya was clutching a juice box, her eyes staring at nothing. Her mother, Elena, looked at me. "She told me about you," Elena whispered. "She said you stayed. She said you helped her pull. I just held on." "Elena," I said. "She was the one doing the flying. She's something else." Elena ran a hand over Maya's braids. "Her father, David, he always told her the sky was her home. People called him crazy. They told him to teach her something practical. I thought about my own father. I thought about the ways we are taught to shrink ourselves so we don't make the people around us uncomfortable. David wasn't crazy," I said. "He was a prophet. He knew the storm was coming, and he made sure she was ready for it." We sat there for a long time while the airport swirled around us. The news vans were already arriving outside. The story was already being written. They would call it a miracle. They would call Maya a hero. But they would miss the fact that for 200 people in that cabin, the color of the hands on the controls didn't matter when the ground was rushing up to meet them. I stood up. Knowing the lawyers and the journalists were waiting, I looked at Maya. She looked up at me, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. "Mr. Julian?" she asked. "Yeah, Maya. Did we find the blue?" I swallowed hard. The noi jauxé long of the morning finally giving way to a strange, soaring sense of peace. "Yeah, honey. We found it, and it was beautiful." I walked away from that bench and into the lights of the waiting world. I knew my life was going to be different now. The mergers and the deals didn't seem so important anymore. A 9-year-old girl had shown me that the only thing worth building is a bridge to a place where we don't have to wait for a plane to fall out of the sky to recognize the power in the person sitting next to us. Before I leave you with this today, I want you to think about something. Who are you pushing aside in your own life? Whose hands are you refusing to trust because they don't look the way you expected them to? We don't have time for the Sterling way of thinking anymore. If this story moved you, please share it. Hit that subscribe button and join this conversation. I want to hear your stories, the times you were counted out. The times you had to find the blue when everyone else said there was only gray. Comment below and let me know. What is the one dream you were told was too big for you? Because the sky has no color. It doesn't care about your zip code, your bank account, or the shade of your skin. It only cares about your heart and your will to stay in the air. I'm Julian Vance, and I'm finally learning how to fly. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of each other down there. The silence of a penthouse apartment at 3 a.m. is a different kind of quiet than the one we had in that cockpit. My apartment overlooks the city of Chicago, a sea of flickering lights. But 2 weeks after Flight 1214, those lights just looked like 1,000 master caution indicators. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the phantom vibration of the yoke in my palms and heard the Noi Jiaoze Long in Maya's voice. I've spent my life running away from the struggle. But Maya's story, the ghost of her father David, it wouldn't let me go. I found myself driving through a part of South LA. I was there to see Maya, but really, I was there to see the man who had trained a savior in the dark. When Elena opened the door, she didn't look surprised to see me. He always said someone would come looking for the truth, she said. The house smelled of cinnamon and old paper. And then, I saw it. In the middle of the living room sat the simulator. It was a beast of a machine. David hadn't just bought a computer program, he had built a cockpit. He'd scavenged parts from boneyards, real throttles. A yoke from an old 737-200. He spent 5 years building this, Elena said. He'd put Maya on his lap before she could even read. And he'd say, "Maya, look at the horizon. The sky belongs to whoever knows its secrets." I sat down in that pilot's seat. I felt a surge of emotional memory, the weight of a man who was a master but was forced to live like a ghost. David had been a decorated Air Force pilot, but when he transitioned to the civilian world, the doors were slammed shut. I looked at the logbook sitting on the side table. It wasn't just flight hours. It was a diary of Defiance. October 12th. Applied for the regional route again. They told me I didn't have the right temperament. I've flown in combat, but I'm not temperate enough. Maya learned the ILS approach today. Her hands are steadier than mine. March 4th. Engine failure simulation today. Maya saved the plane. She asked me why I'm not a master at the airport. I didn't have the heart to tell her that the world sees a different person when I put on the uniform. In this room, the sky is ours. Reading those words felt like a physical blow. David was the real CEO. He had taken the rejection, the racial prejudice that tried to ground him, and he'd turned it into a curriculum for his daughter. He didn't teach her how to fly. He taught her how to overcome the gravity of a world that didn't want her to rise. Have you ever felt like you were living a double life? I asked Elena. She sat down across from me. Every day, Julian, David didn't just teach her the buttons. He taught her how to handle the silence. He knew that when the crisis came, people wouldn't trust her voice. I realized then that Flight 1214 wasn't an accident. It was the moment David's blueprint finally went into production. The drama in the cockpit was the collision of two worlds. The world that ignored David, and the world that needed Maya. I stayed there for hours before I left. Maya came into the room looking like a normal 9-year-old girl again. "Mr. Julian," she said. "Are you going to fly today?" I looked at the simulator. "No, Maya. I want to make sure your dad's blueprint doesn't stay in this living room." I left that house with a different kind of transformation happening inside me. My success was hollow if it didn't create a path for the Mayas and Davids of the world. I drove back to my penthouse, but for the first time, I didn't look at the city as a trophy. The media was still calling it a miracle, but I knew it was a legacy. It was a father's love, built out of scrap metal and sheer will, finally taking flight. 1 month later, I found myself standing in front of a mirror in a high-rise office in Los Angeles. I was wearing a new suit. I looked the same. The mask was back on. But the man behind the eyes was a stranger to the man who had walked into this building a month ago. I was there for the merger. The big deal. The boardroom was filled with men who looked like Mr. Sterling, gray hair, blue ties. "Julian," the chairman said. "Glad to see you're back. That was quite a publicity stunt you pulled on that flight. The PR department says your hero status has bumped our stock by 4 points." The room erupted in polite, Dry laughter. Publicity stunt. The words felt like a "Noi Jiao Se Long." They saw a child's bravery as a bump in the stock. I didn't laugh. I sat down at the head of the table. It wasn't a stunt. "Arthur," I said. The room went silent. A man died. A child saved 200 lives. And I realized something in that cockpit that isn't on the balance sheet. Arthur raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "Julian, we're here to talk about the acquisition of Apex Media, not your personal growth." I stood up. I didn't plan it. It was just a transformation that had been brewing. I walked over to the window. "I'm pulling out of the merger," I said. The silence was absolute. Arthur's face turned a deep shade of red. "You're what?" "Julian, we've spent 18 months on this. You can't just walk away because you had a religious experience on a plane." "I'm not walking away because of a religious experience," I said. "I'm walking away because I realized I've been sitting in the wrong seat. This table is empty. It doesn't build anything. It just consumes." I thought about David. I thought about the racial prejudice that kept a master pilot on the ground, while the world praised men who had never seen a storm. "I'm starting a foundation," I continued. "The David and Maya Foundation. We're going to build flight schools in the neighborhoods. You guys don't even like to drive through. We're going to find the masters who are currently driving buses because they didn't have the right temperament for your corporate culture. You're throwing your career away for a social project." One of the board members asked, "Julian, be practical. I'm at the top of a mountain that's made of glass." I countered. "In that cockpit, I saw a girl who wasn't practical, but she was prepared. And I realized that if I stay here, I'm just another pilot slumped over the controls, letting the plane fly itself into a mountain." I picked up my briefcase. I felt a lightness, a sense of hope. I was no longer a CEO of a company. I was becoming a pilot of a movement. "Arthur," I said, looking him dead in the eye, "you remember Mr. Sterling. He spent the first half of the crisis trying to push a little girl out of the way because he didn't trust her. Don't be a Mr. Sterling. The world is changing. And if you don't start looking for the people who actually know how to fly, regardless of what they look like, you're not going to like the landing." I walked out of that boardroom. I could hear them whispering, calling me unstable, but as I stepped into the elevator, I felt like I was finally ascending. I walked out into the sunlight. My phone was buzzing with 1,000 messages. I ignored them all. I sent a single text to Elena. "I'm in. Let's build that school. Let's find the blue." As I drove away, I looked up. A plane was taking off. Climbing into the blue, I realized that the story wasn't over. Flight 1214 was just the takeoff, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't wearing a mask. If you've ever felt like the room you're in is too small for the person you are, I want you to remember Maya. Don't let the Arthurs of the world tell you where you belong. You belong wherever you have the courage to fly. I'm Julian Vance, and the view from here, it's finally clear. Stay strong. Keep your eyes on the horizon, and I'll see you in the blue.